Welcome back. I'm excited to be making this video and I'm glad y'all are here. Today is about the order of tree care priorities. Tree health care, like us, there are certain things that are just more important than the others, or at least more time sensitive. And that leads me to this next point. All of these things are important. There's 5 general areas, but there are many more. These particular areas are the ones that I feel make the biggest difference, and research shows, as well as my personal experience, that many of these are the most important. Now, the order of them, that's kind of my personal opinion, as well as some that's based off scientific evidence. There's been research done on this, on the priorities of them. So we're going to start with number 1. Number 1, the most important thing that you can do, and you'll hear me say this often, is to have a certified arborist come out and do a consultation, which would include an assessment of the tree or all of the trees. That's absolutely the most important thing that we can do. We need to know what's going on. We need to know, most importantly, is if the tree is safe. We need to know if it's alive or dead and if it's worth trying to do anything for. But when you have a certified arborist come out and do an assessment or a consultation, they will check and see if there's any clear and obvious deadwood. Are there any areas that look like the tree is going to fail? Is there a split in the tree? What's the likelihood of the failure? Is there a disease that is extremely important? Or is there an insect pest that needs immediate attention? Or what we're looking at, maybe some symptoms or signs of either the insect or the pest are really not that bad. A good, experienced arborist can tell you that. Sometimes it's nice to know that you don't have to worry about anything. So that's worth someone coming out to take a look at that. But we need to know that first. We need to know what we're dealing with, and a consultation from a qualified, certified arborist is number 1. Number 2 is water availability or soil moisture levels. This is right next to knowing if the tree is dangerous and what the issue is. This is clearly a very strong number 2. And water can make all of the difference in the world. We can be doing everything right. You can be pruning the trees, keeping the trees from being affected from construction. But if there is not the proper amount of water, then we see all kinds of issues. There can be too much water. Too much water that doesn't drain, which drainage is actually, and we'll be coming up to that. So if there's too much water, that can be a very bad thing. A lot of people don't think about that part. But if there's too much water or there's a lack of proper drainage, then we can have some issues like the soil can become anaerobic. Anaerobic soils and anaerobic conditions encourage the bad fungus and bacteria. The bad diseases like Phytophthora, they like an anaerobic environment. So too much water can suffocate the roots. It starts all kind of negative diseases. If there's too little, as in a drought, then the tree starts to respond in certain ways that take a very long time to recover. As in, like, it can take up to 10 years for a tree to recover from drought damage or drought stress. There's a lot of things that happen. Feeder roots die off. They actually create a waxy substance on the roots that help conserve water, and that takes a long time for the tree to recover from. They use energy that they use for defenses and diseases and insects. Watch things. So if there's not enough water, and as in there's a drought for long periods of time, we can have some real issues that take a long time to recover from. So water is easily number 2. One of the simplest ways to monitor this at home yourself is to have a moisture meter, and we'll talk about that later, but a moisture meter helps you know exactly how much moisture is in the soil, or very close. I can get very particular, and there's ways to do that. But a moisture meter works wonderful. Also, having a licensed irrigator come out, if you have an irrigation system, that's really probably going to be the fastest thing that you can do. And really, we don't have a whole lot of time if there's a water issue, whether there's too much or too little. It is important, so it's worth having an irrigator come out at least once a year. Have them check the irrigation system. If you're keeping an eye on your own irrigation system and doing your own repairs, I think that's great. It's wonderful. It's fun. It's really nice to know the inside and out of your irrigation system. But if you haven't really been doing that for a while and haven't studied it, it takes a long time to get that right. As far as licensed irrigators, that can be a career for someone their entire life. It's complicated, it's beautiful, it's important, and there's a lot of details to it, and there's a lot of variables. But it takes a long time to learn that, to learn it properly, and to diagnose the irrigation system properly. I think it's just worth calling an irrigator out. I had a hard time finding irrigators that did the proper job, and even way less are those that really take into account the different types of trees and shrubs and grass, landscape, whether it's sunny or shaded, or what direction the property is facing. It's taught in the classes, but a lot of times it's not followed as often as it should be, and that's why I got licensed. And now I understand why there were so many issues. It is much more complicated than I ever thought, but it's important. So anyway, a licensed irrigator could be the fastest way to figure out if there's anything major going on with the irrigation system. You need to know that it's working properly. Number 3, soil health and soil compaction. The soil environment is extremely complicated. It's a beautiful thing. It's a lot like the ocean. There's so many, the microbial life is just, it's hard to comprehend. The complexity of it is just fascinating. And it needs to be right for the tree roots to grow properly and provide the trees what they need. So making sure that the soil is healthy is very important long-term for sure. Number 1 with that would be soil compaction. When it comes to soil health, soil compaction can do the most damage the fastest. Soil compaction can affect the top 3 things that affect the soil health the most, and the tree's health actually. So water availability, like we just talked about, compaction can affect that. It can affect the water penetration. It can create runoff, erosion. We need to have the soil. We need to have the water penetrate the soil properly, and compaction impedes that massively. Soil drainage, soil compaction greatly affects that. If the soil gets wet, it can stay wet. It reduces the pore space in the soil, so it's faster to get anaerobic if it's got a lot of water. When it's compacted in various parts of the property, water can run off those areas rather than penetrate like they're supposed to, and it can flood into an area. And if the tree happens to be right there where that happens, we have all kind of issues starting very quick, like anaerobic conditions again, and diseases, basal rots, shoot death. Roots can start to suffocate, all kinds of issues. And soil aeration. CO2 exchange, we need to have that happen in and out of the soil. If it doesn't have proper air entering the soil, then roots can die from that as well. That's why you hear about a lot of lawn aeration. It's a little harder to aerate tree roots because they're deeper, but when the soil gets compacted, that affects that instantly. So soil compaction is paramount for healthy soil. We cannot have overly compacted soils. And unfortunately, it's easy to get soils compacted, depending on the soil structure, like clay. It's really easy to get clay compacted versus sand, which is much more difficult to compact. But clay, or when the soil gets wet, it can get compacted from just foot traffic, from people walking over it, tractors for sure. It doesn't take a whole lot. So compaction's hard to remedy as well. It takes a long time. Like in the natural environment, or if it was left alone, it can take 100 years. So we don't have that kind of time when a tree's not doing well. We don't have 100 years. We need to fix that like fast. And depending on the tree species, we might not have a year or 2 or less of remedying it. So anyway, soil compaction and soil health is very important long term. And there's things you can do to help it. There's things you can do to alleviate it. And we'll talk about that in another video, but I'm trying to keep this a little shorter. Number 4, pests and diseases. It's number 4, but it can also jump to number 2. Certain diseases are extremely important, and they need to be the top priority, second to everyone's safety and property, But a disease such as oak wilt for oaks, emerald ash borers for ashes, those types of things, if we need to fix those we need to fix that really fast. We need to have that properly diagnosed. Those need to be treated just about before anything else gets done, or we won't have time to fix compaction or irrigation and things like that. But a tree having insect pests and diseases doesn't, it's not necessarily always bad, particularly for the insect pests. We need some of those around for the predatory insects to take care of, and that helps with the ecosystem. But there's a certain percent that a tree can handle, a healthy tree particularly, it can handle just fine, and we want to leave it like that. It's highly unlikely, and it's really not really that great to have a tree that looks perfect. Something's wrong with the ecosystem. If there's not a single insect on that tree, or a few little leaves that aren't looking quite right, something's artificially being done, and the environment's suffering, and long term that won't be good. So we want some of that to be around. And so we just don't want the major diseases to get out of hand, or the insect pest to get out of hand. There's a threshold for all of it. Depending on the type of insect pest and disease will determine how important it is to get that fixed fast, or is it really not a big deal. A lot of the time, the reason a tree has an insect pest or disease isn't really looked at. That's much more complicated, takes more time, takes a lot more experience to figure out why the tree got those in the first place. That's what I'm always most interested in. Why did the tree get weak? Why did the tree get stressed enough that it cannot defend itself? With the exception of certain insect pests and diseases, the tree was predisposed to get that in the first place, or there was a reason the tree got stressed to get them. So we need to figure out what that is. And we need to alleviate those immediate stresses so that the tree can begin to recover. Number 5 is an interesting one. These are all very interesting. 5 is a buried root flare, a buried root collar of the tree. This will cause an issue long term when the soil comes up above the root flares or above its original grade. The biology of the tree roots and the trunk tissue and the root flares, they're different. The roots are meant to be in the soil and having pretty much constant moisture, and to deal with that, they are adapt to deal with the stresses of living in the soil. And the trunk tissue up above the soil, above the original grade, it's not meant for that. It's meant to handle a different environment, air. It's meant to get wet every now and then. And when those root flares get covered, it starts to weaken those parts of the tree that weren't meant to be covered. When the soil comes up above the root flare, the tree activates these little adventitious roots, and those roots shoot off in all various directions. As the tree gets larger, it grows up against these little roots that grow larger until it can't break free from them, and they strangle it like a cable, like a rope. It strangles the tree. It's its own roots, but it strangles itself to death. This can be a slow process, and it generally is a slow process, which is why it gets overlooked all of the time. It can be, the tree issues and decline that we're seeing in trees can be attributed to something else that's completely unrelated, because the root flares being buried could have happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And now we're starting to see the issue. Generally, I see when the root flares have been covered, depending on the tree species and certainly depending on the moisture levels of the soil, it can take a few years before we start to see an issue. Except for extreme cases, you can start to see issues within a couple of years. Usually it's closer to about 6 or 8 before it starts to show any issues. And then 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of times it's 30 or 40 years later, and it'll be in a subdivision where a lot of the trees are just declining at the same time, that were built around the same time, and the soil was brought up. And there's similar species that were there before, like oaks, that were there for a long time. It took that long for the trees for it to really start to show bad. It actually had started years ago, but it's usually not very noticeable unless someone's looking for it. And so it's kind of sneaky. So buried root flares will be an issue long term. You can be doing everything right, perfect moisture in the soil, keeping people off the root zone, pruning the trees properly, making sure that the soil has enough nutrients in it. And if the root flares are buried and it gets girdling roots, it will just strangle itself. So that needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed carefully. The air spade is a great way to do it. It can be done by hand lots of the time, carefully, kind of like an archaeological site. But the air spade is my personal favorite for exposing most root flares, definitely and certainly on larger trees. Anyway, there's things you can do for buried root flares, and they're fairly simple to avoid. So it's good to avoid most of these issues so that there's not a problem long term. Okay, those were the top 5. It's difficult to say that any one of those are the most important or more important, but I mean, water, there are some that are a little more important than the others, but any one of these that are causing an issue, they will all cause a problem long term, like detrimental. These are the best ways to help a tree, is to start with these top 5. In this order, for the most part, run through them all, look at each of them individually, carefully. To address each of them, we will get into that later. If you follow number 1 by calling a certified arborist that offers certain services like insect and pest treatments, soil remediation, air spade services, kind of things like that, risk assessments, you might be able to save a lot of time right there. They might be able to get you straight on to what you need to do. But otherwise, we will be getting into all of this. So I look forward to that. Ask me any questions. I tried to make this one a little shorter. It still wasn't very short because, my goodness, there's so much to talk about. All right, I'm going to get going. I'm in Texas. I'm at Pertnellis Falls State Park. I came here to go swimming and do a little snorkeling, but the water's so shallow which is why I shaved my beard, is anytime I'm going to go snorkeling or free diving or scuba diving, I shave my beard so I can get a good seal with the mask. The water is like a little more than ankle deep, so it was nice, but definitely no snorkeling or diving or anything like that. So, but I'm still going to walk around these trails and check out the place. All right, please let me know if you have any questions. I tried to make this quick, so there's a lot of things I didn't cover, but if you have questions, always feel free to ask me. All right, I look forward to making the next video. I really look forward to hearing from y'all. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down in the comments section. I would love to hear from y'all. And I will be making another video as soon as possible. Thanks for watching.